Welcome to our Cooking Call webinar, Managing Azure AD, regardless of how you use it. Azure AD is a reality in most businesses. How to best deal with it in your IAM strategy. This webinar is supported by EmpowerID, and the speakers today are Patrick Parker, who is founder and CEO of EmpowerID, and me, Martin Kuppinger. I'm Principal Analyst at Cooking Call. Welcome, Patrick. So before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping information and a little bit of information about upcoming events of Cooking Call. So the highlight in 2021 will be our European Identity and Cloud Conference, which we moved to September to be on the right time then. And we're looking forward to meet Gasser in person again in September 2021 in Munich. So don't miss this event. It will be, I would say, the must-attend event after 1 year of break to be there. Regarding the housekeeping, there's not much to do for you. We have audio control enabled, so we are controlling audio from our end. We do a recording, and we will provide also the slide decks for download so that you don't need to take much notes. You always can listen to the replay. And there will be a Q&A session by the end of the webinar. However, the more questions you enter during the webinar, during the course of the webinar, the more interesting, the more lively, the more interactive this Q&A session will be. And with that, let's have a look at the agenda. This is, as usual in most of our webinars, split into 3 parts. In the first part, I'll talk about the strategic role Azure AD can play in identity management versus strategies where Azure AD is just a target system. And I'll also look a little at the interplay of Azure AD on-premises Active Directory, which is also a very common scenario of normality, so to speak, for many organizations. In the second part, then Patrick Parker will talk about how to manage Azure Active Directory, on-prem AD, and other services consistently, and how to grow your identity management in an efficient manner. So, and to deliver the IAM, the Azure cloud needs, for instance, for DevOps. So he will look really at a broader picture about what are the options and how to deal with these options in a very efficient manner when we are talking about Azure AD as one important element in our strategy. And I think this is the starting point at the end. Azure AD is very relevant to many businesses because if you have Microsoft 365, which many do, you have Azure AD, and then the question is, what do you do with it? And that is what we will do. And I'd like to start with one slide, and I know Patrick will also sort of reinforce some of these statements. But I think that the point we really need to understand, we need to look at, is that the strategy of Microsoft is very clear on Azure Active Directory versus the on-premise Active Directory. Azure Active Directory is in the focus of the Microsoft strategy. On-premise AD is not the strategic theme anymore. It's an important element still of what Microsoft delivers, but when you look at it from a strategy perspective, their emphasis, their focus is on Azure Active Directory. And so we can phrase this in a simple sentence: Microsoft Active Directory on premises is on its road to legacy. And so when we look at a lot of things which happened over the last few years, specifically over the past year, then in the strategy it is that, as I've said, on-prem Active Directory is not a strategic system anymore. It's something which will be continued clearly, but the investments are targeted on Azure Active Directory. That also means for customers that investments which flow into on-premise Active Directory must be very well sort out, and you need to think about, does it really make sense? Does it make sense, for instance, to any type of migration or restructuring of an on-premise Active Directory nowadays, or is it better to focus your investments on the future? And I have a very clear perspective. You should be extremely careful when it comes to major investments into on-premise Active Directory, because this is what you have and what you need to maintain for a certain period, but the future looks different. So Azure AD is also in many areas the really preferred choice right now. So it comes with Microsoft 365, it's here, but it's also that when you look at a lot of things that are changing, it's that the tendency is that you don't use ADFS or other things to move from AD to Azure AD, but it's the other way around, Azure AD being sort of the primary system. And that's also true when you look at how authentication is changing. And probably most of the ones who are attending this webinar are currently thinking about what to do around authentication, shifting to multi-factor authentication, shifting to new authentication schemes supporting far more authenticators, etc. I think this is obvious because we need to be better in that space today. We need to invest in that. And again, the tendency is very clear. It is not the on-prem AD, which has been the primary authentication system for many years for many organizations. It will be a different system, and that can, and in many cases, will be Azure Active Directory. Not necessarily there are other options, but it is something where we see a change, and this change is really that the strategic thing you need to look first is not the on-prem AD anymore. If it's in the Microsoft space, then it's the Azure Active Directory. If it's beyond that, then there are also other options. But when we look at this part, then it's what we are looking at. And so when we look at a sort of a very simplified pattern of an employee-centric IAM architecture, and you might know from a lot of the webinars, a lot of the KC live events, a lot of the talks we did over the past years, that there are many other scenarios, and we have far bigger pictures. But right now, I really want to shed a light on the sort of the baseline, very abstract, high-level IT HCI patterns. Then you have a series of applications, of services to deal with. That might be a few, that might be hundreds, or might be even thousands of them. Some of these are SaaS services, some of them are traditional on-premise services. And clearly in this pattern, you also find Active Directory, where you have users, and you find Azure Active Directory and a lot of others. And then you have, on the other side, you have your HR and other sources of identities. And you need to bring these things together. And this is where identity management comes into play. You have the identity lifecycle management, you have the access governance, which is frequently referred to as IGA in a combination identity governance and administration. And so data goes from HR to these services, and it goes from there to all the other applications. So you're provisioning to these. And yes, you might then do some things which are a little bit more complex. So you push some things into your IT service management, and the IT service management then creates tickets for the manual fulfillment, etc. There can be a little bit more complexity in that picture, no doubt. So IT service management, frequently something you integrate into this picture. And then there's the other side. So the first part is more the deploy time identity management, in the sense of we create a user, we deploy that user to the systems, we grant certain access rights, we give him entitlements. And then there's the access management portion of that, which is we also need to authenticate day by day and maybe continuously. So adaptive authentication, the entire access management piece come into play, which also need to deal with these systems to provide a single sign-on experience, to also act as another layer of security where we control who can access which of these applications at all. We have privileged access management, which also should ensure that the privileged access to all these applications is handled well. So this is a picture we have within our identity and access management. And yes, there are other identity management services, and there are related security services which also play into this equation, or into this structure we have for our identity management. The Active Directory then might also be a system, frequently is, where other applications rely on. So if you look at this Active Directory integrated authentication, if we look at applications relying on Active Directory groups, then we have applications that integrate with Active Directory. And the same is true for Azure Active Directory. So there are other applications such as Office 365, or today it's called Microsoft 365, which depend on this Azure Active directory. And so Active Directory also might be in fact that the one thing which really delivers the adaptive authentication in this picture, or it might be Azure AD, which in fact are the components which the authentication is based on. So this is the picture we have here. And so when we look at this picture, then we can look at the one or other variant of how this picture could look like. So if we remove a little bit of that, so we removed our Active Directory and Azure Active Directory entries here and what is related to that, then there's a picture where Azure Active Directory takes an active role in a future identity management deployment. So Azure Active Directory is something which then is a system which takes a role in providing a set of services where then the standard on-prem Active Directory is just the target system. And in that case, Azure Active Directory would specifically play that role of being the system which is here in the access management space, providing the active authentication, delivering the access management to all these applications. There are also IGA capabilities, but the common focus clearly in these scenarios is then saying I built some pieces of my access management or the central pieces of my access management on that system. So this is something where then Azure Active Directory also controls, so to speak, the on-prem AD as a system and clearly also serves as that system which Office 365 relies on. The other pattern for the future, when you say we have Azure Active Directory, it might be that we say it's not that active, that strategic element which we have, where we build certain capabilities of our overall identity management infrastructure. That's what we call, and you'll find a lot of publications on that term, what we call identity fabric at KubeCo. So it's not an essential element in the identity fabric. You might also say it's just a target system, and this is something which is a strategic decision. That is a decision you need to make, and in that case is that another system then really manages the Azure AD. So we're going in some way back to that picture we had earlier. Both approaches are viable approaches. Both are meaningful approaches, have their pros and their cons. The important thing is that you understand you need to make a decision. You need to understand where are you heading with this entire strategy. And that also might be a sort of a dual play. For instance, we see a lot of companies which use more than one access management tool, for instance, for different use cases in certain combinations. So there are different places you can play, different architectures you can go for, but you need to understand that you need to make a decision at that time. It is that step you need to be clear of, because the world is changing, and the one thing is clear: the on-prem AD will not be the long-term strategic front end and sort of central element. This is definitely about to change, and that is where you need to adapt. So you can look right now at a couple of factors that influence this decision, and I'd like to touch some of these. So clearly one aspect is, and we must be clear about it, it's a vendor lock-in. If you say I'll build everything around Azure AD and I have Microsoft 365 and all these other things, then there is some sort of a vendor lock-in, which you have with other vendors as well. You might have had it if you're long enough in the business with your IBM mainframe. You might have it with your SAP system and with certain other types of business applications. So it's not that this is new, but I'm a big believer in saying, okay, vendor lock-ins are totally okay as long as you do it based on a clearly made decision. And you need to understand what are the consequences. How can you get away from that? And then, but that's a decision. If you do it, then do it right. Usually Azure AD, by the way, is the consequence, not the cause for that login, because it starts with saying, oh, I go for Office 365, and then you made a very important step here. On the other hand, frequently it's just a question with which vendor you get that login. The application support, you need to look at, if it's a central element, can it support all these applications you have, all these legacy web applications, all the other downstream applications, all the new SaaS services? Is the support broad, and not only broad, but also deep enough? That is something you need to evaluate. That very much depends on the application landscape you have in your organization. Overall capabilities, have a rough look at what do you need. And that also, by the way, starts with requirements analysis. Understand your requirements, and from the requirements, then understand what the various options you have. And there are many vendors in the access management market. Understand which vendors fit best to your requirements, which fit best into your infrastructure, make the decision very roughly. That's a tools choicing, and you will also observe in 2021, we started already this year, but in 2021, KuppingerCole will provide a lot of virtual events looking at the tools choice done right, so to speak, for various segments in the identity management and in the cybersecurity market, which might give you some interesting guidance here as well. What do you have? So is it a replacement? Is it closing a gap? So how does your infrastructure look like? And that is the next question, clearly. If you already have something which is super cool and super smart and well established, does it make sense to change it? How's the interplay between Azure AD you have anyway for Office 365 with your other solution? Might there be use cases to be better? So also look at the interplay to IG and PAM. How seamless works this? How do the features Azure AD provides for IG and PAM work for you? Will they play a role? Look at other factors like cloud risk management and assessment. We get this question about what is the level of risk? What are the mitigations you have with whichever type of cloud service? And this is something which must be a standard process, a standard evaluation for every, I would say, IT service you procure. Risk analysis and understanding the consequences of that. The licensing aspects are an important aspect. Regulatory requirements for protecting critical applications. So maybe you need more than one IDP for certain different use cases, for high risk use cases, etc. So it is really not a simple decision, and there's not a wrong or right in that, but it's something you need to consider. You need to think about how will you do that in future, because it's a decision you make for a couple of years. And so you better do it right here. So let's sum it up. The role of AD is changing. It's Azure AD first from Microsoft perspective. When you look at on-prem AD, the relationship versus Azure AD, that must be considered. Azure AD can take a passive or an active role. You need to understand the options. You need to understand what it does mean, how you deal with other elements of technology you might have or you might want to add here. What is the better choice here? And put this in the overall identity management context. So what does it mean at the end for your overall identity management picture? And what is the right way to proceed here? And this is what you really need to think about to make a good decision. So clearly, strategies that are putting on-premises AD at the center are outdated. You need to redefine them, and I think this is the starting point. And then you can think about what is the best way to proceed. And there's, as I've said, there's not a single correct answer on that. There are many options, and all of them have their strengths and their weaknesses. But you need to think about it, because for most organizations, Azure AD it's there. So you need to decide about what is the right place for that. You can't ignore making that decision. With that, I'd like to hand over to Patrick, who's the next speaker right now.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone. As Martin mentioned, I'm Patrick Parker. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of EmpowerID, and here to talk about Azure AD and its role in the organization. So looking at Azure AD, so the big questions that I hear from my customers right now, we've been hearing this over the last year. A lot of things have shifted. Microsoft's strategy or guidance on Azure AD versus ADFS has shifted last year. And this has triggered a lot of questions from customers. The big first question would be, should Azure AD become the strategic primary authentication directory, or should it remain just another directory which is required by a system, Microsoft 365? That's the big question. What's the strategy? Which Active Directory should take the lead? That's the second question. And then when should you make the switch? How do you know for your organization when it's a good time to make the switch? Third question we hear a lot is how to make the switch. If you are going to switch from Azure, from Active Directory on-prem as being the primary central identity and authentication hub to Azure, how can you make that switch seamlessly over time with low risk? And then the last question we always hear, of course, because as an IAM IGA vendor, is which IGA services does Azure AD need? Azure AD does provide a lot of different capabilities. So the question is, where does Azure AD end, and where do we need to pick up with a system like EmpowerID to cover the gaps or to provide a multi-system complete solution? So those are the top questions that we always hear. We're going to try to address those here today. So visualizing the first question is really at the center of your organizational strategy of all your different systems, whether they're the on-prem systems, whether they're the Windows and Mac and PC-based authentication, or your legacy systems. Really, what's going to be at the heart of this strategy? Is it going to be Active Directory, as it is today for most organizations, most corporate organizations, not all, but most? Or are we going to be moving Azure into that central role and then relegating Active Directory to being a secondary directory on premise? So will Azure AD become the hub of your central identity strategy? That's really the question that everyone's wrestling with. So just a little look back at where we started. So markets become fragmented in the beginning. They coalesce at certain points. They fragment again, and then they coalesce. So around 1999 through 2005, I'd say we were in a fragmented directory market. But around 2005, it coalesced around a very common pattern for organizations or strategy where Active Directory was really the central authentication hub for Windows PCs and for applications, typically through web access management. AD was really at the heart of it. Exchange had required Active Directory, which brought it into organizations, and then the Windows integration with Active Directory really promoted it to be the logical source at the primary directory. So that changed over time with the advent of the cloud. You have all these new cloud applications that really, there's no interest by them to do Windows authentication, didn't really make any sense, because they needed to be, across firewalls outside the organization. So really, federation was a requirement to be able to have a single sign-on to these applications. So the natural next step in the evolution for organizations was, since Active Directory was the center, it was very easy to roll out an ADFS server for federation, adding on those cloud protocols to integrate with the cloud systems. Active Directory still being the primary login for both the web now as well as previously the Windows desktop. And then, of course, since you had adopted Office 365, you had this Azure AD out there. Office 365 required Azure AD. It didn't really have much in the way of federation at that time, so it didn't make sense that it would be the primary. So you would synchronize it from your primary Active Directory. That was really the pattern that emerged. A little bit later, again, the market starts to fragment, lots of IDaaS offerings out there. And organizations are thinking, well, ADFS is a little bit behind in some of the technologies for federation, wasn't as advanced in some of the use cases as some of the pure play cloud vendors. And of course, it was a heavy infrastructure investment to manage on-premise. So a lot of organizations at that point moved to where they would have a cloud-based identity provider as the primary authentication for their cloud apps. The cloud apps would be federated. And then that identity provider still really Active Directory was at the center. Customers, even federating with us, customers would say, well, we have the bulk of our users are logging into Windows. So still Windows was really the driver. It was still in the driver's seat as the primary authentication directory, even though you're federating with another identity provider, a non-Microsoft IDP. So now, Over time, Azure built a lot of new exciting capabilities for federation, for passwordless authentication. New announcements yesterday, they announced HTTP header-based authentication for legacy apps on-prem. So it matured and evolved, and sometime last year, Microsoft started giving the guidance to unfederate your Azure AD. Don't use ADFS. Azure Active Directory has the federation capabilities. Unfederate Azure Active Directory and start using a lot of the feature sets within that. And really, customers started looking at this, and that wasn't enough of a driver there, but really what started to push them to that direction and brought up the question of, should we unfederate our Azure AD and have it being a primary authentication source, were some of the features around the Windows desktop. At least for my customers, Windows integrated authentication into Azure AD, Windows Hello, multi-factor authentication at the desktop level, and even the most exciting areas, which would be passwordless authentication into the Windows desktop all the way through to cloud apps. That's really what has brought up the question, should we unfederate Azure AD? And Azure AD takes a much, much bigger role in our infrastructure. So looking again, why are people looking at Azure AD versus Active Directory? It is more secure because it has more innovation. Azure is aggregating a lot of data, and a lot of the development of the passwordless and the multi-factor authentication, it's all being focused around a Windows desktop integrating into Azure AD. That's really where the direction is headed. Just this slide just shows Microsoft's authentication and risk technology. They're analyzing a huge amount of data daily, which you can only do because it's a cloud infrastructure, to identify threats. So that authentication experience can only be more secure and benefit from this information that's cross-tenant, that's using a lot of advanced technology such as artificial intelligence. And then again, tying in that desktop security with Windows Hello for Business, you get that passwordless or multi-factor experience. That's really what we see as the primary driver from customers. I also see that the rapid growth in Teams, basically, with the explosion of remote home working, Teams adoption went through the roof. And Teams adoption is using behind the scenes Microsoft's B2B federation. So it's super easy in Teams to invite someone from another organization. They're added as a guest user to your Azure AD tenant, really without even thinking about federation or the complexities. So that's really driven a lot of the adoption of Azure AD, is just the Teams. It's also much more modern, as Alex Simons from Microsoft said. Basically, they bolted on to Azure all of the native protocols needed by cloud applications, which that's not really going to happen for Active Directory on-premise. So Azure is much more modern, can plug into all of your future applications and future directions. It's also highly reliable. It's globally distributed, load balanced, backed up by Microsoft with an SLA. And of course, it's affordable. The licensing for B2C, B2B is extremely inexpensive. The infrastructure costs kind of disappear because Microsoft's really managing that for you. So a lot of reasons why you would choose Azure AD over Active Directory as the driver for your central primary authentication directory, your strategy there. So the next question that comes up from customers is, well, if we federated a lot of our apps with another identity provider, like EmpowerID or a competitor, what do we do? Does that mean to leverage this benefit where the Windows desktops can use Windows Hello for Business and passwordless, that we need to do a big bang cutover of all of our apps, or else they'll be prompted to log in to all these different apps? And thank goodness the answer to that is not at all. I mean, really, to get the benefits of the Azure AD integration to the Windows desktop, that passwordless authentication, that more secure login experience, you don't have to migrate all of your applications. You can really do a mixed strategy where your applications that are federated with their current identity provider, they can stay like that. That identity provider might have lots of features that you need, like user-managed access for IoT and consumer use cases, or it might have features like claims augmentation, or lots of different things that you need that would not be handled if you migrated them. So there's no need to migrate those. Your identity provider, as long as it supports federating or Azure native authentication, it can just trust your Azure AD, so your desktop PCs can do their hybrid login into Active Directory on-premise and Azure AD. You can even have cloud-only Windows 10 PCs that log directly into Azure. You can start getting the benefits of a more secure desktop experience with adaptive authentication, with risk-based authentication and passwordless authentication, without interrupting your organization or incurring a heavy cost to migrate the apps in a very disruptive project. You can just let that go. So really, you can use the best of Azure AD, unfederated with the desktops, and still get the benefits of leaving your existing infrastructure in place. And then it's your decision in the future whether, when new applications come on board, do I federate them with my existing IDP because I need some of those capabilities, or do I federate it with Azure? Really, it's seamless, so it doesn't really matter. It's just an organizational decision. So then, if we're deciding to migrate unfederated Azure AD, if that decision is made, if you decide that you really want the benefits of a more secure desktop login and server login experience, then what are some of the strategies to make that transition more seamless and more gradual and to lower the risk? So one of the great features that Azure has is they have what they call Azure AD domain services, which is basically your Active Directory, like your on-premise Active Directory, except up in your Azure cloud. And it has a lot of interesting features where it becomes a kind of subdirectory off of your Azure AD. So you can have an infrastructure like we see here where you're doing synchronization of your legacy Active Directory on-premise, synchronizing the users and even the password hashes into Azure AD so that users have a seamless experience logging into on-prem or Azure AD. You also get default tolerance. If one's down, you can still log in. And then you have the Active Directory domain services in the cloud for your workload, your Windows servers and your other services that require Active Directory. Now you can start moving them into infrastructure as a service running in the cloud, leveraging Active Directory authentication. And since that Active Directory is always in sync all the way through from your on-premise to your Azure AD to the ADDS, then really it's a seamless environment where you can balance what your infrastructure investment in one side versus the other. And over time, more things will move to the cloud and you can de-emphasize that on-premise Active Directory. So this gives you the best of both worlds. So I think maybe you're saying, well, you sold me on Azure AD and you're an ISP competitor, so why can't I just use it for everything? And that's a question that comes up a lot. So Azure AD has a lot of features. It has RBAC, it has role management, it has provisioning, it has, with some of the new features, entitlement management. So really, why do I need EmpowerID or any other IGA vendor? Why do I need that? Well, the first answer to that is that it's really a different paradigm. Azure AD is a directory. It is one of your directories. Every organization, well, not every, but almost all organizations have many directories. So Azure AD is one. You might even have multiple Azure AD tenants. You might have AWS, Google, your SAP, your line of business applications. So being at the directory level, you really can't manage other directories or have a view of the global picture. Now, EmpowerID is an identity warehouse, an identity and entitlement warehouse, which means that we have a data model that encompasses all your directories. We're designed for that. All your users, all your permissions, all your fine-grained roles and entitlements, and you have the ability to understand the past state, the current state, and to have policies for desired future states. You're managing a security state based on policies. And it can do that because it can encompass all of your directories regardless of the technology. So really, that's the big difference in paradigm. So Azure does a great job. You can provision applications in Azure, and Azure can provision into these systems. So you register an app like Salesforce, and you can provision Azure users, assign them to the app, or assign groups to the app, and it'll provision into those systems. Now, but Azure manages the linked identity, so it knows what it provisioned and what it's linked an Azure user to an object in an external system. But it doesn't have a full picture. It really has no visibility to the other objects in those systems, to the permissions, to the roles. It's really just managing the linked objects, provisioning, deprovisioning, just very simple. And many use cases require a metadirectory approach. You really have to know all the data. If you're going to do access recertification, you're certifying that a person's access is appropriate in all of the key systems, not just Azure. You have to know their access in the SAP systems, the Oracle database systems, all the systems. So you have to have all that data. Risk management, to understand your risk, you really need to know their access. To do role mining, or to do least privilege delegated administration, you need your admins to be able to have access across multiple systems of different types, not just Azure, but your AWS, your LDAPs, and your other systems. So as we see in this diagram, the IGA is really a complex mix of technologies, and Azure performs one key critical piece. But to have a complete governance model around your Azure plus your other systems, you need to fill in those other gaps. And that's really where EmpowerID plays, is that we complement Azure, we extend some of its existing functionality, and we plug in those gaps so that you have a full governance solution. And how we do it, what's unique? Well, EmpowerID has a concept called compliant access delivery, where you always know what should people have. And the system can measure what they do have, and it's always measuring, well, what can I make their access compliant? Can I give them what they're missing that they should have that's job appropriate, and can I take away what they have that they shouldn't have? So Azure, if we decided that Azure is going to be your primary directory, your most important system, well, Azure is not Active Directory. It's much more sophisticated, much more modern, and it requires a much deeper understanding of the system to understand the risk and to manage it. So Azure traditional systems manage the users and groups, provision, deprovision, but really with Azure, a lot of your risk and the complexity is in the RBAC structure. New types of identities like service principals and managed identities. And really to fully manage it, to manage the privileged access, to manage the lifecycle and the governance, you have to have a full picture. Because as you see a famous quote, that really, if you follow a least privilege model, that even in a security breach where someone gets authenticated to your cloud system, if in a least privilege environment, they really don't have any access to do damage, because the access is least privileged, just in time, and just enough. Okay, here. And Martin, how are we doing time-wise? Just want to double check.
Oh, we're good on time.
Okay, awesome.
I can give you another few minutes.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. So least privilege becomes extremely important. Recent studies have shown that of security breaches in cloud environments, at least 75% of those are customer induced and could have been avoided with proper least privilege management. So EmpowerID really adds that layer on top. So we see in this picture as an admin logged into a web interface, even without any native Azure RBAC access, I could be granted broad capabilities. In this case, I can manage multiple Azure tenants. I can see the structures, the management groups, the subscriptions, the resource groups, and I can do broad enterprise level delegations of who has access to what. I can do reporting on who has access to what. I can automate things. And this is not just across Azure, but across your on-premise Active Directory, your AWS, your Google, your ServiceNow. So really that least privilege umbrella is extremely important. As we're moving workload to the cloud is more sophisticated, more complex, and it becomes an attack surface. So least privilege becomes extremely critical. This year probably will be the year of least privilege in IGA, I would guess, just throwing that out. And you'll see, contrasting that broad privilege, you need to be able to go extremely granular. So if you're doing, third-party identities and you need partners or developers to have access for DevOps, for Kubernetes, for microservices using your Azure infrastructure, you really want to give them tight control. In the preferred world, you wouldn't give them direct access to the Azure portal. They'd have to go through a proxy zero trust interface like we see here, and you can get extremely granular. So in this case, I have a Germany project team working on a microservice app called Project Divergence, and a designated German RBAC admin can only see that one resource group in that subscription, in that management group, in one Azure tenant. They can only see 10 users. They can only see 2 Azure RBAC roles and 3 Azure AD directory roles. And they can completely manage the permissions with, of course, with approvals, audit trail, recertification. So you need to be able to go down to the object level to really have least privilege access, and also to add the time-based element to it so that access is never permanent. It has to be activated when it's needed to be used. Tying into this, there's the admin experience, but the end user should be able to shop for access. They should be able to request Azure RBAC assignments, again, which are complicated. They have scopes, where are you requesting it, for which subscription, which resource group. So you need a system that handles that complexity and understands those data models and can have workflows, approvals, audit trails, and temporary access. You also have, we extend Azure on the provisioning side. So it's great that you can connect Azure to your enterprise applications, and it has an ever-growing list of those, especially those that support SCIM, which is an open standard for provisioning between applications and identity systems in the cloud. So EmpowerID extends this with what we call the SCIM virtual directory, where EmpowerID exposes a single SCIM service where Azure, you can register any application connected to EmpowerID as if it were a directly connected SCIM app in Azure. So Azure sees it as an app, it can provision, deprovision, but really those calls are coming to EmpowerID, and EmpowerID is translating them for legacy systems that do not support SCIM, and it's adding on workflows, approvals, and enterprise requirements like naming conventions, uniqueness, and other things like that. But really, again, the idea is to embrace your investment and extend it with all of the enterprise features that organizations require. So again, just some conclusions, Azure Active Directory is really the future direction for Microsoft, and it's much more than a target system, as Martin mentioned. You really need to make a decision on that. There are many security and cost benefits to leveraging Azure AD, lots of studies out there for that, to lower your costs, reduce your investment in on-premise hardware and the management. Azure AD as a primary authentication directory does not require a forced migration of your apps. You can leave them where they are and still get the benefits of that Windows desktop integration. Implement a plan that enables a smooth transition and the ability to lift and shift workload to the cloud. So really want to have a plan. As Martin mentioned, now is the time to make a plan, make some decisions, and make sure that you have a plan that will enable a smooth transition as your people develop new skill sets as well. You don't want to really do a big bang shift. And then Azure AD is a directory, but again, you have more than one directory, and a lot of IGA functions and PAM functions require that meta directory or identity entitlement warehouse approach. And last but not least, EmpowerID provides a best-in-class solution for organizations focused on Azure. We understand Azure. We go as deep as you can go on Azure. So we offer, the deepest integration to make sure you get the most out of your Azure investment, extending it, and also that you maintain that security that you need. Okay, back to you, Martin.
Thank you very much for all these insights, and you covered so many topics. So let me make myself the presenter again. We already have quite a number of questions here. And what I'd like to do is right now start with some Q&A and look at certain of these questions. So Q&A will what we do. And if you have further questions, that's my question or my ask to the audience, enter these questions now so that we can pick them up. We still have a couple of minutes we can spend on answering your questions. And the first question we have here is one I really like, which is, if we are moving from on-prem Active Directory to Azure Active Directory, how do we handle essentials such as group policies? Oh, here they are, our group policies. One of the, let's say, most interesting features Active Directory has. I've written in former life, so to speak, a lot of books on whatever the handbook for Windows Server 2003, where I really went into the very detail of group policies, so I understand them well. And I understand the benefits and what makes them so scary and complex. But Patrick, maybe you'd like to talk about what does it mean from that perspective?
Sure. Migrating from to use Azure, so you do support two modes. Basically, you have a hybrid mode where your Windows desktop PCs have line of sight access still to a domain controller. So they can still log into the on-premise directory, and at the same time they log into the Azure AD. So you still get the benefits in that environment of group policies. Now, a cloud-only desktop that's logging directly into Azure AD and non-Active Directory, really you're relying on Intune at that point. So Intune to Microsoft's MDM solution, which it's maturing. It definitely does not have the depth of management of group policy yet, or you're doing some third party as well. But Intune is the future direction for Microsoft, it seems, to provide that same experience for the cloud.
Yeah, so it's probably more the, I think, endpoint manager today. Names are changing quickly, but anyway. So one of the really interesting things I would fully agree with you. I think there are then other solutions from the endpoint management, the unified endpoint management market, where we have a broad variety of solutions available. And by the way, there's also Leadership Compass from Coca-Cola looking at the unified endpoint management market. So comparing the different vendors in that space, and you need to take a different approach, but that approach also might be far more adequate to this, let's say, to the age of work from home, because at the end of the day, I think we must think in paradigms where we have endpoints that are accessing services which run somewhere, and the endpoints are somewhere, and so this is changing, and I think a lot of things become easier when we can protect that. We don't know where the endpoint is, and we don't know where the service is. If that works well, then this will also work well when both are within our corporate LAN. But it's far easier than to do it that way, because you cover everything, than the other way around. So there are a lot of questions coming in. So one question here is the hybrid mode out of date, which in that definition would be on-prem AD, sort of at the center, to Azure AD as a system used, or is it the first step? And I think this is the real question, towards an Azure AD strategy. So, which I think that question has a lot of elements. So, is it out of date? Is there still a value? Can it be the migration path, or is it a preferred migration path even? Patrick, do you like to comment on that?
Sure. So initially, that's evolved over time. Initially, when hybrid mode came out, everyone thought that once you'd migrated your last on-premise Exchange server up to Office 365, that you would eliminate hybrid mode. And that's what everyone thought. But then Microsoft built a lot of capabilities into that hybrid mode sync, device write back. They're really synchronizing a lot of additional things for the desktop integration to do the passwordless and the Windows Hello. So really, hybrid mode is a long-term component. I wouldn't expect that you're going to replace it until you really have transitioned to cloud-first desktops that are logging into the cloud. Until you remove that Active Directory on-premise and machines joined to the on-premise domain, I would expect hybrid mode is going to persist for a very long time, because it has a lot more features than before. It was just for hybrid mode. Now it's really a lot of additional things that are getting synchronized, the device write back, the device certificates, all of that.
Yeah, I think we will see very different scenarios, honestly, with sometimes really being more, so Azure AD moving to the center, on-prem AD just being the system which is managed. But also we see even very large companies sometimes which say, okay, we really go very consequently towards, for instance, Windows Hello for Business, or to clearly also to approaches which are totally independent of Microsoft. Also, that is something we see. So there are different ways. But again, I think the point is right now we see the change. We can understand a lot of the future options we have. We understand quite well our future requirements of how IT and identity and security needs to run, and how we will deploy services in workplaces. So I think we have enough knowledge right now to make the right decisions for the future. And this is really, I think, the point. And there's not, as I've said, there's not the one single right option. But I think it's very important to understand what will not be the future, and then decide about what is the right thing to do for the future. So this would be my aspect. Next question, can EmpowerID also act as an intermediary between Azure AD and G Suite to be used for migration, for instance? Or so how does it deal with if you have different worlds?
Yes, and that's one of the things that is the benefit of a meta directory. Yeah, the meta directory approach, or the identity warehouse approach, is you have a person object that has many user accounts, and the relationship of how the data gets synchronized between those systems is controlled by the meta directory. And you can have policies where if a user is in, let's say, G Suite, then these users should get migrated over and be provisioned at Azure AD users. And you can even map the G Suite groups to Azure groups, so that the users, as soon as they appear in Azure, they will get the same corollary group memberships that they had in G Suite. So you can really map the two systems, and EmpowerID will merge whatever you had in G Suite, you have the corollary or the corresponding access in Azure, and keep those two in sync until you remove the system.
Okay, another question I have here is how would you handle password sync from Azure AD towards platforms or applications that cannot federate? Maybe it's worth to extend that question a little. How do you deal with all these downstream applications that are not supporting the modern federation standards, which is not necessarily password sync? So I would say the most frequently used approach is more a password injection thing, either, or credential injection, or it is things like HTTP header injection, like in traditional web access management, where you then have a trust from the downstream application to central authentication system. So, which by the way, I think I already brought some part of the answer. There are various things either AD supports today or will support soon, and there are tons of access management solutions which can be used in conjunction or alternatively to Azure AD, which also provide these capabilities. Some with a very long history in supporting all these downstream applications, because they started long ago. Others which are stronger on the SaaS side, and but also frequently strong in standard credential injections and things like that. So I think there are a couple of alternatives, and including EmpowerID, Patrick, isn't it?
Yes, definitely the header injection, the WAM techniques for web-based apps. And for non-web-based apps, typically in this Azure hybrid environment, you install a domain controller password change detection agent. So in that case, EmpowerID would be listening and detect any password change that gets synchronized to on-prem AD, and that gets encrypted, sent up to a web service. And since the identity warehouse knows for that user what are their other user accounts, and for each of those systems, is it a WAM system, is it a federated system, or is it an old school system that needs a password sync? So for the old school systems, it's going to do a password reset and synchronize that password change down.
Yeah, but at the end, it goes back to understand your requirements, understand your current infrastructure. From that, you understand your needs. Also, you understand what you need today, what you might need in future. And you might be an organization which has hundreds or even way north of 1,000 applications that don't support federation. I know these companies. I've seen these companies. And then you need to go for an adequate approach that works best for these environments. And again, there are different options to do that, but we need to adjust to that changing world we are seeing out there. And then maybe a more technical question to the end. So we have still a few open questions, but I think in the interest of time, let's pick one last question. So can my virtual machines, Linux and Windows, in Azure log in using Azure AD? So fairly technical question.
They can. Yeah, there is. So a lot of those will use, they do a browser-based login so that they can do more of a modern auth scenarios and log into your Azure AD. And then also Azure virtual machines, both Windows and Linux, they actually support Azure native authentication, and you can control who can log into which machines using Azure RBAC. And
Okay.
then worst, you plug in, you add a plugin like SSFD, and you point it back to an LDAP virtual directory like EmpowerID, which can broker that authentication.
Okay, perfect. Patrick, thank you very much for all the answers. Thank you to all attendees for listening to this KuppingerCole webinar and all the questions you asked. It's always very, very good if we have a lot of questions today we had. We will follow up on questions we didn't have the time to answer separately, and hope to see you soon in one of our upcoming KuppingerCole live events, webinars, and all the others. Stay well, and have you back in one of these events soon again. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.